Almost 70 years ago, these men were boys just out of school.
In one fell swoop, you ceased being a boy and you became a man.
So young to be caught up in the world's darkest hour, the last year of the Second World War. Now in old age, these precious few survivors are all around us, hidden in plain view. This is the last chance to hear what really happened firsthand.
German bodies, Canadian bodies, British bodies. The smell, the stench. That's war. That's war.
From the landings on the D-Day beaches to fighting in the Battle of the Bulge in a freezing winter, and storming through Europe uncovering the true horrors of Nazi Germany.
How can human people do that to other human people? How can they do it?
It's their story in their words, not the one written by generals and historians.
After all these years, still makes metal.
Where there's original film, we'll see where they fought. Where archive doesn't exist, we'll use real bombs and weapons to illustrate what our veterans went through. This is the story of the final year of World War II in Europe, as told by the last war heroes. The Allied invasion of Europe was well underway. So far they'd been bombed, picked off by enemy snipers, and slaughtered on the beaches. It looked like the tide was turning. Part of the Allied army raced from the River Seine in France, almost unopposed, for 200 miles, liberating Arras, Brussels and Antwerp. Amongst them was First Lieutenant Patrick Delaforce. From a military family, Patrick always knew he would join the army to serve his country if war broke out.
The liberation welcome in Antwerp was absolutely staggering. It was so great that it got in the way of the war. And all the troops were trying their best to get on with the war. There were girls kissing them. Here's my baby, kiss my baby. Come in, have some coffee, have some brandy. I mean, every temptation you can think of.
For some, it was the first time they'd met friendly faces. After almost 3 months, Patrick and his fellow British troops felt a great sense of achievement.
Antwerp was then the biggest harbour really in Europe. It was the biggest plum for the British Army. We rounded up about 5,000 prisoners, and the best place to park them on a temporary basis was in the huge Belgian zoo. My General Pip Roberts told me the Red Cross had been told that it wasn't fair by Geneva rules to put unarmed prisoners into a zoo. So he simply wrote back and said, well, the Belgians had eaten all the animals, so what's the problem?
After taking the city of Antwerp, the Allies' next task was to open up the port. This would give them a crucial supply line that could serve the advancing ground forces heading towards Germany. The enemy knew they had to stop them, so they aimed their newest and deadliest weapon at Antwerp, the V-2 rocket. Ken Sturdy was stationed there when the first rockets came in.
The V2 could destroy not just a house, but a row of houses. You couldn't dive for cover because you couldn't hear them.
There was one attack he remembers more than any other.
A V2 had come down in a cinema behind the screen. So one end of the cinema was totally destroyed, it seemed. It was the end where the audience were that was still intact. Yeah. And a lot of people, imagine the size of a cinema audience. Yeah. A group of us with the Marines were asked to handle bodies. Even by this time, we'd seen a lot in Normandy, but there was something about this that was so unreal. It was like a grisly nightmare. The dead were seated, staring at the screen, killed by the shock, of course. It was a shock wave that had killed people watching the screen. But there were rows of dead people. I can talk of it now, but at one time I didn't want to even think about it.
Targeted up to 3 times a day and hit by more rockets than London in the Blitz, Antwerp became known as the city of sudden death. At the top-secret section of RAF Fighter Command, a team were tasked with stopping the V2s. A select group was sent to Belgium. One of them, 23-year-old Eileen Younghusband.
Late November, I was told that I would be posted abroad. I was not allowed to tell my husband. I'd been married then about 6 weeks. I couldn't tell him where or why I was going. And there were 8 of us chosen. And our job was to find the launching lorries of these V2s. Then our Mosquito bombers that were flying in sections, that's 2 aircraft, over the whole of the area likely for the launching, could then bomb the lorries. And the whole scheme was we couldn't stop the V2, but if we got rid of all the lorries, they couldn't launch them. So that's what we did.
If Eileen and her team hadn't tried to stop the V2s aimed at Antwerp, the Allied advance could have ground to a halt. The Allies also needed to control the port of Antwerp and secure the supply route for the advancing troops. This meant taking the Scheldt estuary, linking the port to the North Sea. And it was still held by the Germans. This job was given to the Canadian First Army. To the generals, it was just a short push across the map. For the men on the ground, the terrain was like an assault course. Wounded in Normandy, 20-year-old farm boy Bill Davis was back with his old unit, just in time to fight this battle.
I, like most of the guys in the Canadian Army, thought we were real hotshots. There was fear, there's no doubt about it, there was fear, but I think a lot of us felt, okay, let's show them what we can do. These guys think they're tough when they run into the Canadians.
Bill's confidence didn't last for long. The dikes had been flooded, there were booby traps everywhere, and autumn was approaching. In front of them, flat, wet marshland with precious little cover.
That was the dirtiest job we had during the whole war, was taking the Scheldt. The weather was rotten, cold, snow, rain, and no place to get warm or dry. I was getting rather frustrated because we were just getting pelted with machine gun like you wouldn't believe. And most of my guys were gone. And my closest buddy, I got up to look around and he knocked me down and said, you're going to get killed if you keep doing that. But we spent the rest of the day throwing grenades back and forth, the Germans on one side and us on the other side, and it was just murder. The wounded were laying out in the field hollering and yelling. There was only 19 of us left out of the company of over 100, and as we were moving out, I come across our company commander, Major Popham, who was laying there, had been shot through the head earlier in the day. So I went to take his map case and his papers and everything so the Jerrys wouldn't get it. And it scared the hell out of me. He said, "You're not going to leave me here." "You're not going to leave me here, are you, Scoop?" That was my nickname. So I said, well, I didn't know what to say at first because the back of his scalp was laying open. So I put his field dressing on him. Said, "Look, Major, I can't carry you, but we'll go as far as we can." So we did, hanging on to each other. Got him back to where there were some jeeps taking out the wounded, and that was the last I seen him. I wanted to put him on a stretcher. He wouldn't go. I never seen him again, but they tell me he went back to practicing law.
The Canadian First Army was trying to take the Scheldt Valley to free the port of Antwerp as a supply route. The Germans were determined to stop them and attacked with heavy shells and mortars.
You think you're going to be okay, the other guy's going to get it. But the further in you got in the war, more you realize your chances are getting slimmer all the time. And as it got closer to the end of the war, we knew it was coming to the end, the scarier I was, because I thought, if I go all the way through this and get killed now, I always said I'd haunt that German the rest of his life.
20-year-old Doug Vidler was a mortar specialist from Canada. His lasting memory is looking out across the flooded landscape, wondering how he was expected to fight there.
Buffaloes were amphibious vehicles that we could put one Bren gun carrier on, or about a dozen men.
Doug had fought across Normandy with his best friend Bob Gardner. They met just after D-Day and immediately became good friends.
We made this landing during the morning, and Bob was sitting there rubbing a ring, which he told me about his girlfriend and gave him. It had a cross in the center. And he was sitting there rubbing this ring. And I said, "What's wrong, Bob?" He said, "I don't like this." He never ever talked like that before. And I said, "Hell, we've been in worse than this," because it wasn't bad at that time. But it was a bad night. They shelled us pretty bad. Bob and I had been fighting all night. Well, the next day we were sleeping in a barn because we'd been up all night, so in the morning, about 8 o'clock or so, we went to bed. And around 11 o'clock, the barn got hit with a shell. The word went out, anybody hit? And Blackie said he was hit. He got hit in the knee. So with that, I shook Bob and said, Bob, Blackie's hit. And with that, Bob rolled over. He had one little piece of shrapnel on his head. Just one little piece. Hardly bled at all. And he was gone. It was really rough. I was never the same again after that. My nerves were really gone. And I went out to the road, and they were bringing some German prisoners down the road, and I grabbed the Bren gun, and I was going to shoot them all. I was so mad.
It was crucial the Canadians secured the Scheldt Valley. British and American airborne troops would soon need resupplying. They'd been ordered to drop behind enemy lines and capture a series of bridges across canals and rivers between the Dutch and German border. At the same time, British tanks and infantry would push towards them, join forces and cross the bridges into Germany. The generals promised this plan, if it worked, would bring the war to an end by Christmas. Only 18 when he joined up, one of the airborne British soldiers was Bill Bloys. He couldn't wait to drop into enemy territory.
We'd been briefed for 16 jobs in France and Holland, and all they were cancelled. Sometimes the planes got in the air and they'd be flying around, and all of a sudden they would turn around and they'd come back. And people were getting fed up with it. And I remember our leader, I remember him coming up and saying, there won't be any Germans to kill time we bloody well get there.
Frustration grew, as 21-year-old apprentice blacksmith Johnny Peters remembers.
They named us the Stillborn Army because we were there for 3 weeks and nothing happened. Eventually the big one came and we were glad to get away because we wanted to get in and start fighting there. That's what we were trained to do.
On September the 17th, 1944, this massive airborne drop involved 30,000 men, the largest in history.
You could actually step over from one plane to another all the way across the channel. It was so vast. There were still planes still taking off in England while men were dropping in Holland.
Part of the US airborne were ordered to drop at Eindhoven, Zonn and Wegel and hold the bridges for the advancing ground forces. One of the men responsible for getting them to their target was 21-year-old Lieutenant Frank Gregg.
It was on a Sunday afternoon, about 1 o'clock. Sun was shining, and I landed right on the drop zone. And it was filled with big Holstein cows, milk cows. And they panicked, of course, when all these parachutes started coming down. And I'm thinking, oh man, I'd hate to have to write home from the hospital so that I was severely wounded by a big Holstein cow. the Dutch people came out, all carrying bundles of flowers, applejack, and they were passing that out to all of my troops. I'm trying to get the troops' attention and get the heck to our objective, which was a railroad bridge. And so anyway, I finally got them separated from the cows, then the people, and it was real nice. I thought, all operations ought to be like this.
It wasn't long before the fighting started.
The Germans hit hard because they were withdrawing from Normandy and all of the area along the English Channel in Belgium. So there were an awful lot of Germans in the Netherlands, and we found them. Midnight that night, a battalion of Germans came down the road and attacked my bridge. I did not think I was going to make it because I lost about 1/3 of my company. When you lose one man, because everybody is key in those small airborne units, but when you lose half of a platoon, it is really devastating. Then you sit down and you have to write the letters home to the families, and you may be half dead from being tired and out fighting all day, but when you get a chance, you can't let them stack up on you or you'll never catch up, so you have to sit down and write the letters home, and that is tough. It is with deep regret that I inform you that your son or nephew or whatever his nearest relative was listed on his record was wounded in action and subsequently died at the hospital, or he was killed on the battlefield, wherever you were. You had to keep it pretty bland because we were under strict censorship, at that time. And that's about all you could say. He was a good soldier,
Hundreds of Frank's men died holding the bridge near Weigel.
I was able to hold that bridge in case the British had to use it to run their tanks across, tanks and trucks. And they decorated me for holding the bridge. Never used the bridge at all.
Frank Gregg and his American comrades had secured their bridges, but to the north British troops weren't faring as well. They'd been instructed by General Browning to hold a bridge for 48 hours. Ground forces coming from 60 miles away would relieve them. Things got off to a bad start when 350 troops were dropped 7 miles from their target, the bridge at Arnhem. They were led by 26-year-old Brigade Major Tony Hibbert.
One of the first mistakes that Browning made was that he dropped us 7 miles from the bridge, and we were all carrying about 80 pounds worth of equipment, and you can't run all the way.
93-year-old Tony Hibbert is one of the few officers who fought in Arnhem still alive today. He was aware that High Command knew about a crack division of panzer tanks re-equipping near Arnhem. His superiors shrugged it off and sent the troops in anyway.
Well, you accepted your orders and you got on with it, and there was nothing else to do.
As Hibbert and his men were setting up their defensive positions, the bridge began to shake.
We thought that the tanks were in fact our own tanks coming from the south, the ones that were actually going to relieve us. And we had about 160 people on the bridge, and they all took off their helmets and put their berets on and came out to cheer them forward. Of course, it wasn't until they came up to the top of the bridge that we saw that they'd got the wrong insignia on.
It was the German panzers heading across Arnhem Bridge, straight towards Tony Hibbert and his men.
They all had to dash back, and we had a wonderful battle.
The men on the bridge at Arnhem had just repelled an attack by a German panzer division. They were pinned down under heavy fire, but holding their ground. The tanks expected to relieve them were still miles away. For Tony Hibbert and his men, the fighting now spread from the bridge onto the streets of Arnhem.
There was a great deal of hand-to-hand fighting, a great deal of bayonet work. When things got really sticky, the corporal would order fixed bayonets and then go out, and the Germans ran really fast and they didn't like it.
They'd posted snipers all around the town, so the British did the same. Johnny Peters from Liverpool was a natural with a rifle.
The Germans kept firing from these houses all day long. It was like being in a cowboy film. They were ricocheting off, twing, twing. It was comical at the time. Later on, a patrol of Germans came along right in our front with an officer with about 20, 30 soldiers. We opened fire on them, and they were just like sitting ducks, you know. We killed several of them then. One chap I see, and Sergeant Watson say, "Get that man." So I was lucky I shot him. We were trained to do that, kill him, you know. The first chappie I killed, well, I lined the bloke up, and I thought myself, you know, before I shot him, he's got a mother or a sweetheart or wife, you know. That's the only time I ever thought before I shot him, yeah.
Back on Arnhem Bridge, Bill Bloys was out on patrol when he spotted a shelter that looked suspicious.
There was a storage of ammunition on the bridge, but we didn't know it was ammunition inside. Each group had its own flame carrier by the engineers. Called an engineer up, give it the works. It went up like a bomb. Bang! The bridge shook. It caught a light all around. Oh my God.
In the streets around the bridge, the Germans with their greater numbers and firepower were pounding the British.
When we were in the house, there might be a squadron of us in the house there. Jerry started firing at us, of course. So we ran out and got into the next one, you see, and they followed up and let us have it in that one. Well, they had these tank blasters that they blew the front of the houses right out, and they knocked them out one at a time. As we getting out, they were following us and letting us have it, you see.
A friend of mine called Private Jackson, he said to me, "Johnny, I've been shot in the neck." And he said, "I think it's come out the other side." And it had. It come out the other side of it, because he got a stiff neck. And so I said to him, I knew he was in shock. I said, "Do you think I can go and try and get you some tea somewhere?" So he said, "Yes, if you don't mind." I left my rifle. I went 300 or 400 yards. I found a bloke making tea. I asked him, could he give me a mess full of tea? And he said, yes. Told him I was wounded. I just got away when they shouted shell in this area. When I looked at the tea, it was full of sand, so I had to chuck it away. I went back to where he was. All I see was a man on a stretcher with his leg off. Couldn't find this Fred Jackson.
Johnny never found Fred Jackson. If he hadn't gone to fetch him tea, Johnny might not be alive today. At the bridge at Arnhem, the situation was chaotic. Medics were unable to evacuate the wounded, radios weren't working, and the men were completely cut off. The ground forces sent to support the Allies were still miles away. The generals had planned for 10,000 men to hold the bridge at Arnhem for 2 to 3 days. Instead, 740 men held it for over 4. Because of this, the Germans intensified their attacks.
They'd been pumping smoke shells into our building, which of course have phosphorus in them. And at least half our men in the brigade headquarters building had to spend their time putting out fires. All the time, artillery shells bursting, and every time they burnt, they sent great lumps of rubble flying through the air all around you.
Arnhem was in flames, and the troops had nowhere left to hide.
We knew that the game was over. We were running from one to the other and getting out the way and fighting and running. And that was Jerry's were winning the battle then.
We had 2 medics, 2 doctors, and they was working like hell. And the casualties started to really build up. And the Germans knew this.
They'd virtually been without any sleep. We were without water, we were without food, and we'd run out of all medicines. And they all kept their spirits up, and they were still laughing and joking. They didn't think of themselves very brave people. They were the best.
We were hoping, kept hoping, you know, when's the army coming? The officers, they didn't know, but as I say, a morale boost said they'd be here tomorrow. Tomorrow never came.
Unable to treat their wounded, the Allies realised they'd have to swallow their pride and raise the white flag.
Everything was devastated. I felt ashamed that we had been there and let these people down. To me, it should have never taken place.
Bill was captured, taken prisoner and sent to a salt mine in Germany. He escaped, was caught, sent back to the salt mine, only to escape again. Johnny Peters was one of the lucky ones. He got away by boat across the Rhine.
The Daily Express man took a photograph, all small and that, and then that was in the Daily Express the next day apparently, and the caption of that was, "They fought like lions." And my mum, my mum couldn't afford the paper, someone come and said, "There's a paper here, they blokes in Arnhem, you know, fighting Arnhem, they're fighting airborne." And she said, "Oh, that's my son," and she collapsed. She recognised me. Yeah.
Tony Hibbert was also taken prisoner. He lay hidden amongst the rubble of what was once Arnhem, only to be discovered by German officers and taken away with some of his men.
About 10 miles out of Arnhem, the lorry was stopped. And as it started again, I and another officer jumped off the lorry, and I managed to escape. As I was escaping, the German corporal in charge of the lorry turned his Schmeiser onto my comrades and shot 6 of them dead. And that will remain with me for the rest of my life. I think that's the only time I remember any real emotion.
The massive airborne attack had failed. The troops had landed in different places, almost randomly across Europe, and couldn't connect up. Operation Market Garden was a disaster. The Canadians were more successful. They'd almost taken the Scheldt Valley and the estuary that would open up the port of Antwerp. Walcheren Island was the final stronghold still in enemy hands. It was heavily fortified with enormous concrete gun emplacements. To support the Canadians, the generals sent in the Marine Commandos. Among them was Jim Kelly from Liverpool.
They said they had to take that island, and that's why it became very important, because it dominated the Scheldt estuary, and no shipping could get past it because it was a mass of guns in huge concrete emplacements.
Jim had joined the Marines as a token act of revenge for the Luftwaffe's bombing of his hometown.
A troop, which I belonged to, weren't the leading troop at that time. And the the men on the left flank. They'd caught it in the minefield, and there was 4 men went down.
Carefully hidden below the flooded surface, the Germans had covered the ground with mines known as bouncing betties. This is what happens when a soldier's boot triggered the device. Jim knew he had to tread carefully to get his mates out.
I went across into the minefield and poked my way across to the first fellow. When I lifted him up, there was a pop, and the mine popped out the ground in between his back, the middle of his back, and my chest. And I had 4 seconds, I think. It didn't go off, so I just took him out in my own footsteps until I brought the 4 out.
With everyone safely out of the minefield, Jim and the others still had to take on the bunkers.
And the concrete emplacements were huge. They had a full-size hospital in one.
As they approached, they had no idea what resistance they would face.
Once we got on top of them, they just locked the doors and stayed there. We banged on the doors and we shouted at them, to come out and that, but we ended up, for most part of the time, just lying on the top of them for a night, freezing cold. And the next morning they would come out with all their gear packed, the little haversacks and whatnot. And they'd come out and just surrender. And each battery by battery by battery, we did that, right round the island.
Defeated Germans were giving up. Jim and his men began to move quickly from bunker to bunker between the dunes, assuming they'd taken all the Germans prisoner.
Went down into the sand dune, and as soon as we went down into the hollow, the Germans fired. They knew they had us. It caught in that ball. And the next thing was we had shells and mortar bombs raining down on us, so paid the price. We lost 12 men on that day, and we could have ill afforded to lose 12.
Jim had multiple shrapnel wounds. He was taken to hospital and returned to England. He was mentioned in dispatches for his role at Walcheren. The men had succeeded in taking the general's objective, opening up the Scheldt estuary. Ammunition and supplies could now flow through the port of Antwerp and get to troops on the front line. The atrocities Doug Vidler witnessed, including the loss of his friend Bob, resulted in what's now known as post-traumatic stress disorder.
Losing my best friend and the shelling really got to me. And they wanted me to be a sergeant at the end, and I refused it. I didn't want to be responsible for other guys. I had enough to do to look after myself.
Doug received treatment, and his nightmares finally came to an end. After helping his injured company commander, Bill Davis, also known as Scoop, was himself injured and returned home.
How they got the job done, I don't know, but I'm very proud. To have served with those guys. Very proud. That's a red hackle. We wear that in our hat instead of a badge. and I wear it every chance I get.
In the next chapter, the men set off to liberate Berlin, but Hitler fooled them with a major counterattack at the Battle of the Bulge. Hundreds died in the coldest winter in years as the men found themselves fighting from foxholes in the snow-covered forests of Germany.
Tree bursts, mortars, Nibelwalfers, 88s. You're just cannon fodder.
And at the town of Bastogne, the men were surrounded, outnumbered, low on food and ammunition.
You're cold and hungry and wet, but you still go. And go and go.